Hello everyone. This is Ashraf Hassanpour from Shiraz University of Medical Sciences, Anatomical Department. In this set of lectures, we are going to discuss the human skull anatomy. Even though it looks like one bone, the skull actually consists of about 22 to 29 single bones, which are mostly connected together by fibrous joints called sutures. I say 22 to 29 because we can also consider the hyoid and inner ear bones, but in this lecture we won't be covering those bones. The skull is divided into two parts. The first is the brain case, also known as the cranium or neurocranium, which encloses the brain. In addition to the neurocranium, there is the facial skeleton known as the viscerocranium, which provides structure and support for soft tissues of the face and houses the teeth. Let's first look at the structure of the brain case or neurocranium. This part of the skull is composed of 8 bones: the frontal bone, the ethmoid bone, the sphenoid bone, 2 parietal bones, 2 temporal bones, and 1 occipital bone. The brain case can be divided into 2 parts: the skull cap, which we also call the calvaria, and the cranial base. If we look at the top of the skull, you can see that the skull cap is made up of a paired parietal bones and parts of frontal bone as well as the occipital bone. From this view, you can also see these lines separating the bones of the skull. They are called sutures. As we mentioned before, the other part of the brain case is the skull base, which is the lower portion of the neurocranium. Looking at it from the inside, it can be subdivided into the anterior cranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. The cranial base comprises of the frontal bone, ethmoid bone, sphenoid bone, occipital, and temporal bones. Now let's move to the front of the skull again, where you can see the face. The facial skeleton or viscerocranium is include 2 nasal bones, 2 lacrimal bones, 2 zygomatic bones, which are known as the cheekbones, 2 maxillae, 2 palatine bones, 2 inferior nasal conchae, 1 vomer, and the mandible, which is connected to the skull via the temporomandibular joint. From this view, you can also clearly see 2 major landmarks of the facial skeleton: the orbits, also known as the eye sockets, and the nasal cavity. Let's again define some differences between terms such as the skull, cranium, and calvaria, as they often cause a little bit of confusion. The skull refers to the entire bony framework of the head, including the mandible. The cranium refers to the skull without the mandible. And the calvaria refers to the skull cap, which consists of the upper part of the neurocranium or the superior portion of the frontal, parietal, and occipital bones. Okay, to best understand the complex nature of the skull, we first examine some individual skull bones in detail. Then, in the next section, we examine the skull as a whole and learn which bones are best seen from a particular view. So, first of all, we'll focus on bones of the neurocranium, including the frontal bone, the ethmoid bone, the sphenoid bone, 2 parietal bones, 2 temporal bones, and 1 occipital bone. Then we'll move on to some bones of the visceral cranium. Let's start off with the bone that you can see now, here, highlighted in green, that defines your forehead from both an anterior and lateral perspective, and we call it the frontal bone. The frontal bone, which is one of the bones that encases the brain, consists of 3 parts: the squamous part, the orbital part, and the nasal part. The squamous part makes up the largest portion of the frontal bone and encompasses the area of the forehead. The orbital part is essentially the part of the frontal bone that contributes to the bony orbit, and the nasal part is the portion that articulates with the frontal processes of the maxillae and the nasal bones, and this is basically the portion that helps form the root of the nose. So, let's talk about some bony landmarks associated with the frontal bone. And the first one we can see here. It's a smooth and slightly elevated area above the nasal root and is known as the glabella. The squamous part of the frontal bone is the vertical flattened region. The squamous part ends at the supraorbital margins, each of which forms the superior ridge of the orbit. The midpoint of each supraorbital margin contains a single supraorbital foramen or notch, and this is an important structure because this is where the supraorbital blood vessels and nerve pass through. Superior to the supraorbital margins are the superciliary arches, which are the brow ridges. Male skulls tend to have more pronounced superciliary arches than do female skulls. Within the frontal bone is a pair of frontal sinuses. The frontal sinuses usually start to appear after age 6 and become more fully developed after age 10. However, some people never develop these sinuses at all. The orbital part of the frontal bone forms the roughly horizontal roof of each orbit. The inferior surface of the orbital part is relatively smooth, but it contains some opening for blood vessels and nerves heading to or from structures in the orbit. The shallow lacrimal fossa marks the location of lacrimal or tear gland that lubricates the surface of the eye. Lateral to each orbital part is the zygomatic process of the frontal bone, which articulates with the frontal process of zygomatic bone. The internal surface of the frontal bone roughly conforms to the shape of the anterior portion of the brain. The inner surface of the frontal part bears a prominent frontal crest that marks the attachment of membranes that, among their other functions, prevent contact between the delicate brain tissues and the bones of the cranium. Now, let's move on to another bone that you can see on the lateral side. Well, clearly from the lateral side and also a bit from the posterior view of the skull. And this is the temporal bone, if you remember correctly. And the temporal bone is a large, bilaterally symmetrical bone which forms part of the base of cranial vault. Actually, these bones form the inferior lateral walls and part of the floor of the cranium. Each temporal bone has a complex structure composed of three parts: the scamus, tympanic, and petrous parts. Now, let's take a look at the internal part of the temporal bone. Here you can see the thick petrous part of the temporal bone that houses sensory structures of the inner ear and provide information about hearing and balance. In here, you can see the internal acoustic meatus. It provides a passageway for nerves and blood vessels to and from the inner ear. A groove for the sigmoid sinus runs along the inferior surface of petrous region. The sigmoid sinus is a venous sinus that drains blood from the brain. Externally, the prominent bulge on the inferior surface of temporal bone is the mastoid process, an anchoring site for muscles that move the neck. Rather than being solid bone, it's filled with many small interconnected air cells called mastoid air cells that communicate with the middle ear. The next structure is a thin pointed projection of bone called the styloid process. The styloid process serves as an attachment site for several hyoid and tongue muscles. The stylomastoid foramen lies between the mastoid process and the styloid process. The facial nerve extends through the stylomastoid foramen to innervate the facial muscles. The carotid canal is medial to the styloid process and transmits the internal carotid artery. The scamus part, or scama, is the lateral flat surface of the temporal bone immediately inferior to the scamus suture. Immediately inferior to the scamus part, a prominent zygomatic process curves laterally and anteriorly to unite with the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. The union of these processes forms the zygomatic arch. Each temporal bone articulates with the mandible inferior to the base of both zygomatic processes in a depression called the mandibular fossa, or we can also call it the glenoid fossa. Anterior to the mandibular fossa is a bump called the articular tubercle. Immediately posterolateral to the mandibular fossa is tympanic part, a small bony ring surrounding the entrance to the external acoustic meatus or external auditory canal. Let's move on to another bone of the neurocranium, the occipital bone. This bone covers the back of your head and makes up a large part of basilar part of the neurocranium and houses a structure, the cerebellum. This is the only cranial bone to articulate with the cervical spine. The occipital bone is subdivided into a flattened scamus part, which forms the posterior region of the skull, and a median basilar part, which forms a portion of the base of the cranium. Within the basilar part of the occipital bone is a large circular opening called the foramen magnum, and lateral to this foramen are a smooth knob called occipital condyles. The skull articulates with the first cervical vertebra at the occipital condyles. At the anteromedial edge of each condyle is a hypoglossal canal through which the hypoglossal nerve extends to supply the tongue muscles. Posterior to each occipital condyle is a variable condylar canal which transmits a vein. Some prominent ridges appear on the external surface of occipital bone. The external occipital crest projects in the posterior direction from the foramen magnum and ending in the external occipital protuberance. Intersecting the external occipital crest are two horizontal ridges, the superior and inferior nuchal lines. These ridges are attachment sites for ligaments and neck muscles. Males have larger and more robust nuchal lines because males tend to have larger muscles and ligaments. The portion of occipital bone that helps form the jugular foramen is called the jugular notch. The concave internal surface of the occipital bone closely follows the contour of the brain. Additionally, there are impressions named for the venous sinuses within the cranium. For example, the groove for the superior sagittal sinus, the groove for the transverse sinus. Also, on the internal surface of the occipital bone, at the junction of the left and right grooves for transverse sinuses, is the internal occipital protuberance. An internal occipital crest extends from the protuberance to the posterior border of foramen magnum. This crest is a site of attachment for falx cerebri, a connective tissue sheet that helps support the cerebellum of the brain. The neck bone has a complex shape and is shaped as a butterfly. The sphenoid makes up most of the middle part of the base of the skull, as you can see here, and contributes to the floor of the middle cranium fossa. The sphenoid is often referred to as a bridge bone or the keystone of the skull because it unites the cranial and facial bones and articulates with almost every other bone of the skull. Medially, it has a thick body which contains the sphenoidal sinuses. Laterally, it extends to form the greater and lesser wings. Although the sphenoid is relatively large, much of it is hidden by more superficial bones. Let's talk about more details of this bone. Here you can see a prominent midline depression between the greater and lesser wings. This depression is termed the hypophyseal fossa, and the bony enclosure around the hypophyseal fossa is called the sella torsica. The sella torsica houses the pituitary gland. On either side of the sella torsica are projections called the anterior clinoid processes and the posterior clinoid processes. The anterior border of sella torsica is formed by the tuberculum sella, and the posterior border is formed by the dorsum sella. Anterior to the sella torsica, a shallow transverse depression called the optic groove crosses the superior surface of the sphenoid bone. An optic canal is located at either end of this groove. The optic nerves that carry visual information from the eyes to the brain travel through these canals. On either side of the sella torsica, the foramen rotundum, the foramen ovale, and the foramen spinosum penetrate the greater wings of the sphenoid bone. These openings transmit blood vessels to the meninges around the brain and nerves to structures of the orbit, face, and jaws. Now, looking at the posterior view of the sphenoid bone, you can see here the trigoid processes of the sphenoid. The trigoid processes are vertical projections that begin at the boundary between the greater and lesser wings. Each trigoid process forms a pair of medial and lateral trigoid plates, which provide the attachment surfaces for some muscles that move the lower jaw and soft palate. Let's move on to the next bone, the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is one of the most complicated bones of the skull. This irregularly shaped bone is positioned between the orbits. Also, it forms the anteromedial floor of the cranium, the floor of nasal cavity, part of the medial wall of each orbit, and part of the nasal septum. The ethmoid has three parts: the cribriform plate, the ethmoidal labyrinth, and the perpendicular plate. Let's look at it individually. The superior part of the ethmoid bone exhibits a thin mid-sagittal elevation called the crista galli. This bony crest is the point of attachment for the falx cerebri, a membranous sheath that helps support the brain. Immediately lateral to each side of the crista galli, the horizontal cribriform plate has numerous perforations called the cribriform foramina. These foramina provide passageways for the olfactory nerves, which provide the sense of smell. The ethmoidal labyrinth, dominated by the superior nasal concha and the middle nasal concha, is best viewed from the anterior and posterior surfaces of the ethmoid. The ethmoidal labyrinth is an interconnected network of ethmoidal air cells. These air cells are continuous with the air cells found in the inferior portion of the frontal bone. The ethmoidal air cells are also open into the nasal cavity on each side. Mucosal secretions from these air cells flash the surfaces of the nasal cavities. The perpendicular plate forms part of the nasal septum, a partition that also includes the vomer and a piece of hyaline cartilage. Now let's move on to another bone that you can see on the lateral side of the skull, the parietal bones. The right and left parietal bones form the lateral walls and roof of the cranium, so they form the major part of the calvaria. The external surface of each parietal bone bears a pair of low ridges, the superior and inferior temporal lines. These lines mark the attachment of the temporalis muscle, a large muscle that closes the mouth. The smooth rounded parietal surface superior to these lines is called the parietal eminence. A parietal foramen sometimes occurs in the posterior 1/3 of the parietal bone adjacent to the sagittal suture. A tiny imaginary vein travels through this opening, connecting the venous sinuses with the veins of the scalp. The internal surfaces of the parietal bones retain the impression of cranial veins and arteries that branch inside the cranium. Alright, now that we have covered the bones of the neurocranium, we are ready to move on to learn more about the bones of the viscerocranium in the next section. Thanks for watching. Happy studying.